Let me get this recorder started. We're going to go to the end of Reconstruction now and talk a little bit about Ulysses Grant and Rutherford B. Hayes. Again, kind of get our brain back engaged. Reconstruction is exactly what it sounds like. It's the rebuilding of the United States after the Civil War. Not just physically rebuilding, like rebuilding the roads and the trains that we destroyed, but rebuilding the Union, bringing those states back in. And we've seen that the South has been treated like a defeated nation, which it was. Without a doubt, the South was a defeated nation. They seceded, they formed their own country, they were defeated. But as the 1860s become the 1870s, people get a little tired of that. And people start to looking for answers. What can we do to try and solve this? And the first guy that we're going to deal with is this guy, Ulysses S. Grant, or as I like to call him, Useless Grant. Grant was the greatest Civil War general we ever had, and he ranks down there with Warren Harding and Jimmy Carter as worst presidents ever, okay? By most historians' records. He's the Republican candidate for president in 1868. And he wins largely based on his record as a military war hero. He's an interesting choice for president. He's really never been good at anything in his life except being a general. He graduated last place in his class at West Point. By the way, Robert E. Lee graduated first in the same class. He actually washed out of the Army at one point, and they let him go. They forced him into retirement. Tried to be a shoe salesman, failed at that. Tried to be a farmer, failed at that. When the Civil War broke out, they called him back, and he finally had some success. Well, now we're going to make him president, and you can imagine he's not going to do a wonderful job all the time. He wins because of the freedmen's votes. All of those former slaves that got the right to vote, they recognized Grant as a great hero. Remember, at this point, blacks were voting in bloc as Republicans. They're going to vote Republican all the way up until the 1930s, when Franklin Roosevelt's going to capture the African American vote. So from 1868 all the way up to about 1932, the black vote is going to be a Republican stronghold. It hasn't been since then. But that's what's going to carry Grant into the presidency. Grant's going to do a few good things, a lot of bad things. But the most important one he does is he passes the last of the Reconstruction amendments, the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment gave black males suffrage. Again, if you don't know what suffrage is, you must know that. It's the right to vote. So now we have all three Reconstruction amendments. I'm going to go over this again. I know you're tired of hearing it, and I keep harping on it, but these are on the STAR test every stinking year, okay? And they'll be on your first test in my class. The Reconstruction Amendments 13, 14, 15. 13, freedom. 14, citizen. 15, vote. How do you remember this? You have to be free before you can be a citizen, and you have to be a citizen before you can vote, okay? So it's kind of a natural progression. If you can just kind of get that through, you're going to get 3 questions right on your test, and probably 6 or 7 questions right on your STAR test. So that was Grant's baby, and good amendment, real good amendment. We like the 13th, 14th, and 15th. The other thing he does is he passes the Anti-Klan Bill. We talked about the Ku Klux Klan a little bit yesterday. The Ku Klux Klan was an organization of former Confederate soldiers that were originally it was just a gentleman's club. It was just these men. And by the way, Ku Klux Klan is a kind of a joke name. It was originally called the Ku Klux Klan, C-U-C-L-O-S, which is a Latin word for circle. And they were the Knights of the Circle, and it was this brotherhood. But they kind of played off it and it became Ku Klux Klan, all this stuff. That's eventually going to be taken over by these people that are against the 15th Amendment, and they start terrorizing blacks. In the South, the Ku Klux Klan would sit there in their uniforms, their these flowing gowns and the hoods, at the ballot box, and if you were black and you showed up to vote, they'd write your name down and somebody would come visit your house later that night. It was a terror organization. So Grant passes this bill which allowed the police to break up Klan actions. A lot of states passed laws against wearing masks in public. By the way, that's still illegal in a lot of states to wear masks in public. If you were politically aware a year or two ago when Occupy Wall Street was going on, you saw a lot of the guys out there were wearing the anonymous masks, the Guy Fawkes mask, and they got arrested for it. This is the law that they used to prosecute them, was this Anti-Klan Bill. Has a good effect. It does decline the number of attacks on African Americans, although not real strong. I didn't go into all of the scandals in the Grant administration, but I kind of want to talk about them just a little bit. They're not up here, but Grant's problem wasn't that he was a dishonest man. Grant was an incredibly honest man from everything we could tell, but he trusted his friends and he surrounded himself by the wrong kinds of people. He had situations like something we call the gold conspiracy. A guy named Jay Gould. Jay Gould was a railroad magnate, and Jim Fisk was another big robber baron. And they cornered the gold market. I'll explain it to you. You won't ever have to know it for a test or anything, but just for your own knowledge. Back in these days, gold is what backed all our money. You could literally take your money to the bank, and if you had a $20 bill, you could hand it to them and demand $20 in gold. The good old days, right? Today, our money's not backed by anything. It's backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. Its only value is because we believe it has value. That wasn't true back then. Well, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk went to the president, and they showed him that the cost of gold had been gradually going up for a period of months. And they convinced the president that for us to back our money and for us to be able to exceed or increase the money supply, we needed more gold. The U.S. should have more gold. And we should purchase it now while gold was cheaper because it was going to go up. It makes sense. If you look at the chart, you saw gold had been going up. It makes sense. If I have to have gold, we buy it now before it gets any higher. So the president gave an order to purchase, just an open order, purchase gold. What he didn't know was that Jim Fisk and Jay Gould had lied to him. The reason gold had gone up was because Fisk and Gould had been buying gold on their own and taking it out of the market and setting it back. That means they were creating scarcity. There was less gold in the market and they were driving the price up. So they bought it cheap. They drove the price up. And then when the president issued an order, they dumped all this gold in the market at one time. The U.S. bought it at inflated prices, and then the gold collapsed in cost. They were crooks. They stole this money from the government. But here's the deal. What they did wasn't illegal. It was just good business practices at the time. Today it would be illegal. Other things that happened. You had the Secretary of Indian Affairs was given a great deal of money in order to take care of the Indians. And instead of taking care of the Indians, they used that money and they purchased spoiled meat and fed it to the Indians. And a lot of them died. And that meant there was more money left over, and he pocketed the difference. He went to prison for that when he got caught. You had the Salary Grab Act, where Congress gave themselves a 100% pay raise, plus they voted themselves 2 years back pay. So not only did they double their pay, but they said, you owe me back pay for 2 years. They gave the president a 200% pay raise. So you had all this stuff that was happening, all this corruption. And that's going to really hurt Grant. In the midst of all this, we have to find a way to fund this Reconstruction. How are we going to pay for this? Well, we have to jack up taxes. So our nation, a nation that was built on a tax revolt, all of a sudden had the highest tax rate in the industrialized world. By the way, we've been right around there for a lot of years now. They sold a lot of bonds. We started borrowing money. This is how we kind of got into this system that we're in today. This is the beginning of it. We have to pay off our war debt, so we sell bonds. The bonds is us borrowing against a future debt, okay? So people buy the bonds, they get it at a high percentage rate, and we end up getting in this cycle where you can't pay your debts off. It's going to work out pretty poorly for us. We're going to have the Panic of 1873 at this time period. Panic is an old-fashioned word for depression. You know, today we would call it the Great Depression or a depression. If you were around in the when the housing bubble burst, some people called that a depression. It was really a recession. It was close to it. This panic was as bad as the Depression of 1929, okay? And it was caused by a lot of similar reasons. What had happened was banks had been loaning money at very, very cheap rates for a while. But they had loaned so much money that people were using it and they were buying land. And the thought was, I'll buy this land out west, I'll borrow the money, I'll buy it, and then I'll flip the land. Somebody else will want it and I'll make money and pay the debt back. But eventually that market gets flooded and there's nobody to buy it. And then people couldn't pay their debts back, so the banks end up having to foreclose on the debts. They end up having to go in there and demand their money back. There's no way to collect it. So banks ran out of money, and they started closing. And in those days, there was no FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. If the banks ran out of money and your money was in the bank, you were just out of luck. And people thought their money was safe, and all of a sudden, it was just gone. Your whole life savings could have been gone, because it was loaned to somebody to buy this land to speculate, and they made a bad business deal. Well, because of this, the banks close. Because people don't have any money, they can't buy stocks, and the stock market starts to drop. Eventually, the stock market collapsed. It's going to take more banks out, and it's going to put us in a serious depression. Now, why do we not call this the first Great American Depression? Well, because so many people were self-sufficient at this time that even if you were poor, you might not know the difference. Okay? It hurts your people in the city the most. It hurts your workers. Your farmers are still going to be able to farm. And that's what the majority of Americans were at this time period. Now, we spent all these years since 1865 making great strides forward in civil rights. And I don't care what anybody tells you, the Reconstruction time period was great for civil rights. Think about it. African Americans went from being slaves to being free, to being citizens, to having the right to vote and own property. In some cases, in South Carolina, they elected an African American governor. In Texas, we elected some African Americans to our state legislature. That is a massive change in a very short period of time. But by the end of Reconstruction, that starts getting undone. People start finding ways around it. And civil rights start to reverse. States started passing laws, two in particular, the literacy test and the poll tax. You need to know these. They will be on your test. These are two ways that states kept blacks from voting. It also kept poor whites from voting. Literacy test. I will be honest with you, I love a literacy test. I love the idea that you have to take a test to show that you know something about what's going on before you go vote. That sounds wonderful to me. But that's not what this literacy test was. You see, because they didn't establish a test everybody had to pass. It wasn't like you had to pass a citizenship test. They left it up to the local election judges to determine whether you were literate or not. And they said they could apply a test. So this is how it would work. You show up, I'm the election judge. And, Carson shows up there and he says, Mr. A, I'd like to vote. Well, Carson and I, we agree on a little bit of politics. And I'm pretty sure he's going to vote the way I want to, so I hand him a copy of See Spot Run. I say, what's this book about? And he reads it. He says, well, Mr. A, it's a book. It's about a dog. His name is Spot, and he's running. Congratulations, Carson. You're literate. Not a problem. Then Tyler comes in, and Tyler says, Mr. A, I need to register to vote. Well, I don't know if I can trust how Tyler votes. So I say, not a problem, Tyler. I just need to get you registered to vote. I hand him a copy of the complete works of William Shakespeare and ask him to explain it to me. Can you do that? You got 10 minutes. No, probably not. I'm sorry, Tyler. You're illiterate. You don't get to vote. This is the way it worked. I'll give you an example of how efficient this was. I have a copy of my great-grandfather's voter registration card. He signed it with an X because he couldn't sign his own name. But he passed a literacy test. Okay? There were African Americans who had PhDs from black universities that were deemed illiterate. So the literacy test was just a racist way of preventing people from voting. Okay? The other thing is the poll tax. Now, the law says that you cannot prevent somebody from voting based on race, creed, color, or previous condition of servitude. So after they said the literacy test was illegal, and they did eventually, we said, well, we're just going to have a tax to vote because it's expensive to run an election. But here's the deal. You didn't just have to pay your voting tax for that year. If you missed a year, if you didn't vote one year, you had to go back and pay your back tax for the years you didn't vote. And since most people only vote in presidential years, that means they're skipping the off-year elections. You have to pay 2 years worth of taxes in order to vote, and you couldn't afford that. Most of your blacks couldn't, and your poor whites couldn't. As a result, guess who's going to come back to power? The wealthy whites in the South. Because they're the only ones that are getting to vote. There was another one we passed. I didn't put it up here, but it's called the Grandfather Clause. It said that you had to have a tradition of voting. Your father or your grandfather had to have voted in an election prior to 1864. Well, then they were able to say, well, we're not stopping you from voting because you're black. We're stopping you from voting because you didn't vote before 1864. Well, you couldn't vote. Blacks didn't have the vote then. But they tried all these systems. Then we have one of the most interesting elections in all of history. The election of 1876. Grant really wants to run again. He's ran twice. He's won two terms. He wants to run for a third. By the way, nobody has ever done that to this point. There was no law against it. There was no rule that said you couldn't run for a third term. But nobody had ever done it. But Grant's pretty unpopular because of his scandals, and he's also not real healthy. He has throat cancer by this point. So he steps back. And there's a battle for who's going to become the Republican nominee. And the Republicans do what often happens to a successful party. When parties get successful and they start winning a lot of elections, a lot of people jump in and the party will start dividing into different groups. Happens a lot. We're seeing it with the Republican Party right now. Have been for about 4 years now. Saw it with the Democratic Party last election cycle. When you're successful, this happens. Well, the Republicans have they really had 3 strong candidates. Roscoe Conkling, he was the old school Republican. He was the Lincoln Republicans. They called them the stalwarts. They're the ones that the old people that have always been Republicans supported. Then there's James G. Blaine. James G. Blaine led a group that was called the Half-Breeds. They were the moderate Republicans. They were the ones that, we can kind of get along with everybody. They're the middle of the road Republicans. And then you had Benjamin Bristow, which was the liberal wing, the liberal Republicans. They're the ones that were Democrats until Republicans started winning. Okay? So you've got these three different wings out there, and they're all challenging for the presidency. And in those days, we didn't have primaries. We went to conventions. These were the good old days. I would have loved to have gone to one of these conventions. They'd go to a national convention. All the party bosses, all the big party wings would show up. The guys would give speeches. Deals would be made. You'd be meeting back in a smoke-filled room, smoking cigars, drinking bourbon, playing poker, and talking politics. And you'd make deals to decide who was going to become your candidate. And everybody thought James G. Blaine was going to get it. But to get the nomination, you have to get 50% plus one, okay? You got to get better than half. And when the votes come, nobody gets better than half. Blaine gets the most votes, but it's not enough. And the chamber explodes, and there's literally fist fights. These guys are drinking too much, and there's some serious arguments happening. And Rutherford B. Hayes, who, by the way, went there to nominate James G. Blaine. He's actually the guy that nominated Blaine. Went up there, introduced him, and called for his support. Rutherford B. Hayes was sent out there to try and calm the crowd down. And he went out there and he started talking to them about calming down and the principles of America and how we needed a stalwart, strong Republican in order to take the fight out there. And all the people started listening to him, and a strange thing happened because he's not even running for president. He's not even supposed to be there. He's just there to nominate somebody. But everybody starts going, James Blaine's my favorite, but if I had to, Rutherford B. Hayes would be a good second. Roscoe Conkling's my guy, but if I can't get him, that guy Rutherford B. Hayes is pretty good. Bristow's my guy, but that guy Rutherford B. Hayes, he's okay. And suddenly he became everybody's second choice. And somebody yelled out Hayes' name from the floor. We don't know who did it. And all of a sudden it builds up and a chant happens. And from the floor of the convention, through a voice vote, Rutherford B. Hayes, who wasn't even running for president, got the Republican nomination. That's a pretty cool story. By the way, that's the history book version. You are never going to convince me that Hayes didn't have people out there seeing that stuff going, hey, call my name. I've been to enough conventions, I know how this stuff works. But he manages to get the nomination. So he's the Republican nominee. The Democrats, they don't have a problem. They nominate Samuel Tilden pretty easily. So now we have these two guys running. And it's time to vote. Election day comes about. Everybody casts their votes. We get the vote results back in. They're telegraphed in. And when you add up the electoral votes, Tilden has won the presidency 203 to 165. Tilden is our new president. Except there's something that a lot of us aren't aware of. When you go vote on that Tuesday in November, that's not really the vote that counts. I don't know if y'all are aware of this, but all you're really voting for are electors to send them to the Electoral College. And then they show up, now in January, then in March, they showed up, and they cast their votes, and that's the one that really counts. Well, Tilden has won, and it's clear enough that Hayes actually sends a telegram to Tilden congratulating him. And then somebody calls Hayes aside and says, hey, I think we can still win this. What do you mean we can still win this? He says, well, it's close enough that if we can switch a couple of votes in Florida and Georgia and Texas, Florida being the big one, I think we can get the Electoral College. And they started sending messages. Can you hold Florida? I said, yeah, we can hold Florida. Florida's already gone to Tilden. Can you hold Texas? Yeah, we can. No, Texas is already gone. But Hayes sends a message to the southern states. And he says, listen, if you'll vote for me in the Electoral College, I'll end Reconstruction. I'll pull the troops out of the South. I'll let you have your governorship back. Martial law will be over. And all the punishment from the Civil War will be done. Is that a pretty big bribe? It's a real big bribe. Getting the military out of the South? Well, when they showed up to vote, Hayes wins the presidency 185 to 184. It's that close. One vote. Enough people switched their votes. Now, did Hayes just steal the presidency? I would say that he absolutely stole the presidency. I would also say that what he did was not illegal. I would also say that, guys, this could happen today. The laws have not changed. Some people would say this is what happened in 2000 when George Bush won over Al Gore. When Al Gore won the popular vote and George Bush won the Electoral College, same kind of concept. By the way, it was Florida again then too. Florida always screws up our elections. Okay? So Hayes is now the president. The first time in American history that our president lost the popular vote. It's happened 3 times. We call this the Compromise of 1877. So this vote is so close that this compromise is made, and this is the list. You'll need to know about this. We're going to remove all federal troops from the South. That's it. No more troops. Hayes agrees to put Democrats in his cabinet. If you don't know what a cabinet is, it's the president's advisors. He agrees to spend federal money rebuilding the South. Pretty big bribe. We're going to go down there. We're going to rebuild the roads and the bridges and the tunnels, and the railroads are the big one that we destroyed in the Civil War. And the last one is he said that he would demand Democrats respect African American rights. This is a pretty good compromise. And it worked. This is what ends Reconstruction. So Reconstruction goes from 1865 to 1877. Think about that. The war lasted 4 years. Reconstruction lasts 12. Imagine being somebody in this time period. Most of y'all are 16, 17 years old. That would be your whole life. You wouldn't have known anything but war or Reconstruction. The nation is in a pretty bad shape. All right. The next lecture that we're going to do is on industrialism. I have a quiz for you. I have not posted it on Blackboard yet because it is over Reconstruction and industrialism, and I don't want you to get ahead of me. So next time we meet, we'll do that. It's probably going to be a pretty long lecture because we're behind, but we'll get that done. Okay? I'll see you guys later.